This story today is so haunting, it lingers long after the last word. Set amid the vast, breathless silence of the American frontier, where fate crosses paths with mercy in the most unforgiving land. It is a place where a single choice can turn enemies into guardians and isolation into legend. It begins with one dying child, something small, fragile, and easily ignored, yet powerful enough to shift the balance of survival forever at Ashen Vows. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. In a country shaped by dust and mourning, one small mercy was enough to ruin a life. This was never a tale of shootouts or glory. It was a story about a decision, quiet, human, that set violence in motion. A solitary widow, carrying more memories than hope, comes upon a dying Comanche child, the son of the man her people fear most. She could walk away and let the sun and birds finish the work, save herself the trouble. Instead, she lifts the boy into her arms, takes him home, and shuts the door on a world that would condemn them both. For 3 days, she becomes his refuge. On the 3rd day, his father arrives, a war leader whose word moves hundreds of riders. This is how one woman's compassion drew an army to her land, and how that army chose a path no one imagined. The plains lay silent, but it was not an empty silence. It pressed in, thick and breathing, and to Lorne Whitby it spoke. It drifted through the dead corn stalks of her untended patch, wrapped itself around the lone chimney of her sodden timber cabin, and carried with it the dry smell of earth and far-off rain. That hush had long since swallowed the sound of her husband's laughter, Bram Hollis, and the imagined footsteps of a child she heard only in the fragile hours before dawn. Lorne had been shaped by that quiet, beaten into endurance by loss. Her hands, rough and split, knew both the swing of an axe and the careful pull of thread through cloth. Her face, framed by hair bleached pale by years of sun, told its own history. Fine creases marked where she'd squinted into the Texas glare. A faint scar traced her chin, left by a runaway wagon wheel, and her jaw carried the hard line of a strength she acted out more than she felt. Her homestead sat alone, an island surrounded by rolling grass, 5 miles from the nearest hint of people at adobe walls. The place barely deserved the name of town. Just sod houses, a saloon, and a trading post crouched together as if warmth might come from closeness. Comfort, however, never reached that far. The men there were lean and wary, their spirits baked dry by the same sun that cracked the soil. They spoke in low voices, traded rumors like currency, and lived with an unrelenting dread of the Comanche, the phantom riders of the plains. To them, a Comanche was only acceptable if he was dead. Lorne had once believed that too, back when her world stretched beyond this 160 acres of grief. 2 years had passed since the raid that made her a widow. Bram had been caught in the open, fixing a fence line. They hadn't come for him. He was simply there when they struck a neighboring spread, nothing more than a body in the way. That was how the officer at Fort Elliott explained it. Lorne called it that the moment time broke apart. Since then, fear lived quietly inside her, a steady vibration beneath every breath. A loaded Winchester rested beside her door, a Colt heavy at her waist, and she knew exactly how to use both. Still, her fear ran deeper than Comanche war parties. It came from the land itself, vast, empty, and watchful. And from her own heart, buried so far down, she sometimes questioned whether it still moved at all. Late one August afternoon, heat shimmering above the ground. Lorne was walking back from the creek, with 2 full buckets knocking against her legs. The water lay nearly a mile away. Thinner every week without rain, the only thing keeping her place alive. As always, her eyes swept the horizon. She searched for motion. The twitch of a tail, the flash of metal, the thin rise of dust that meant riders. Then she noticed it, a dark blur against the brown earth, something out of place. Not stone, not brush. It lay collapsed near a stand of mesquite she knew well, where a solitary hawk often claimed the highest limb to hunt. Lorne Whitby stopped short, her pulse stumbling hard in her chest. It might have been a calf dropped by thirst. It could have been a coyote, or it could have been something worse. She set the buckets down, dragged her damp hands across her canvas skirt, and eased the colt free. The weight in her palm offered little comfort, but it was something solid. She advanced with care, boots grinding softly against the baked earth. The quiet thickened, as if the land itself were listening. Step by step, the shape sharpened. It was a person, a boy. What covered him was little more than shredded buckskin, his skin the deep copper of the Comanche. He lay face down, one arm stretched forward as if grasping for help that never came. His long black hair was tangled with dust and something dark and drying. Lorne's first reaction was raw terror. Cold fear slid over her skin, icing the sweat along her spine. A Comanche, here, on her ground. Was this bait? Were others hidden in the grass, bows drawn, faces painted for blood? She dropped low, eyes cutting left and right, listening past the pounding in her ears. There was nothing. No movement, no sound beyond her own breath. Slowly, she edged around him. She kept the colt steady in both hands. He was small, 10, maybe 11 summers. His back told a brutal story. A long, angry gash ran from shoulder to ribs, swollen and crawling with flies. Still, that wasn't what was killing him. The fever was. Heat poured off his body in waves, his thin frame shuddering under it. Each breath rasped, shallow and uneven, like a flag torn loose in the wind. She nudged him with the toe of her boot. A weak, brittle groan slipped from his mouth. He was alive, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Everything she'd been taught, everything carved into her by loss, urged her to leave him there. Walk away. He was the enemy. His people had taken Bram Hollis and left her to rot in this ocean of quiet. A snake in the grass was still a snake, even when young. The red clay men would call her foolish for hesitating. They would brand her a traitor for doing more. They would drive her off, or worse. Fear tightened around her throat like a hand. She looked again at the boy, at the dirt-caked fist clenched beside his face, at the faint flutter beneath his lashes. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't some nameless horror from campfire tales. He was a child, a dying child. And with that truth came the memory of another, Wren, lost to fever 3 winters past, before she had ever learned to speak his name. That grief had crept in quietly, unlike the violence that stole Bram. But it had carved her hollow all the same. She remembered the helplessness, cooling her baby's burning skin, listening to those tiny, broken breaths until they stopped. She was staring at a ghost now, and she knew she couldn't turn away. "Damn it all to hell," she whispered, the words splitting the still air. The curse she'd spoken wasn't meant for the boy. It was for the choice now planted in front of her, for the unwanted stirring of a heart she thought long dead. She slid the Colt back into its holster and dropped to her knees. The air around him reeked of sickness, and heat. Carefully, she slipped her arms beneath him. He weighed almost nothing. Too light, bones sharp under burning skin. As she lifted him, another sound tore from his throat, a thin cry of misery that sliced through her fear and bitterness alike. The walk back to the cabin stretched into the longest mile she had ever known. Every hiss of grass, every shifting shadow at the edge of sight became a rider with a lance. She felt watched, judged, by the red clay men and by the boy's people both. She belonged to neither side now. A traitor standing between worlds. She kicked the door open and carried him inside, where the dim coolness closed around them like mercy after the sun. She didn't lay him on her bed. That felt like crossing a line she couldn't name. But on a rough pallet of blankets pulled close to the hearth. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing hard, the weight of her decision crashing down on her. She had brought an enemy across her threshold. She had dragged war into the one place she'd kept untouched. Drawing in a shaking breath, she forced the fear down. There was no undoing this. She had chosen, and whatever followed would follow. She turned to the stove, her movements quick and deliberate. The fire was fed not for comfort, but for boiling water. From a small wooden box, she took what little she had: carbolic-soaked bandages, dried herbs, jars of homemade salve. When she began to clean the wound, the boy stirred. His eyes cracked open, dark and unfocused, filled with pain and bewilderment. For a brief heartbeat, they fixed on her face, and she saw no hatred there, only the same raw fear she carried inside. Then his gaze slipped away, and the fever took him again. Lauren worked through the afternoon and into the night, her cabin glowing like a lone spark in the endless dark of the prairie. She washed the wound, stitched it closed with hands that trembled but did not falter, and packed it with a sharp-smelling salve. She tipped cool water between his split lips. She wiped his burning skin with a damp cloth, murmuring soft words meant as much to steady herself as to calm him. She did not know his name. She did not know where he came from. But as the moon climbed high and shadows stretched long across the floor, one truth settled in with terrifying clarity. She had risked everything to save a dying Comanche child, and in this country, debts were never forgotten, sometimes paid with goods, sometimes with grace, and most often with blood. The first day was over. 2 still lay ahead. The second morning broke in pale gold and soft rose. Light far too gentle for the storm brewing inside Lauren Whitby's walls. Sleep came in scraps, stolen while she rocked in her chair, the Winchester resting across her knees. Every groan of wood, every distant coyote's cry jolted her awake. She stood guard over her own home, protecting a secret heavier than any coffin. The boy still lived. His breathing remained shallow and strained, though the violent shaking had eased into a steady tremor. The fever clung to him, dry and relentless, leaching the air of moisture. All night, Lauren had pressed willow bark tea to his lips, the bitter liquid spilling down his chin more often than not. Still, she prayed that some of it had gone where it was needed. His fevered state dragged strange sounds from him, low, rough syllables in a tongue she couldn't place. They came broken and uneven, soaked in pain and a deep, aching grief. Now and then, his hands tightened and released, fingers clawing at the coarse blanket as though he were trying to hold on to something slipping away. In those moments, he wasn't a shadow from a feared people at all. He was only a child trapped inside a bad dream. Then, through the haze of his muttering, one word cut through with desperate force, spoken clear and sharp: Mahru. He said it twice, each time followed by a weak whine that struck something tender in Lorne Whitby. It sounded like a name, or a plea meant for a father, or perhaps a spirit. The word lingered in the still air, heavy with meaning she could sense, but not yet grasp. Mahru, she repeated silently, locking it away in her thoughts like a jagged piece of a puzzle she feared completing. Her world narrowed until it was nothing more than the inside of that cabin. The wide plains, the open sky. The idea of life beyond her doors felt as distant as another life entirely. Everything she had was focused on the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest. She worked steadily, quietly, meeting his needs as they came. She changed the dressing on the wound, red and inflamed, but not yet carrying the deadly stink of rot. She coaxed a few spoonfuls of thin broth into him, a small success that felt like winning a war. Late in the afternoon, he surfaced briefly. His eyes opened and settled on her. The fear was still there, dulled now by exhaustion. He followed her movements as she stirred the pot by the fire, watching her as if anchoring himself to something real. Lorne felt his stare like a hand against her skin. She turned, spoon in hand, and did not smile. A smile would have been a lie. Instead, she gave him a faint nod, barely there, but deliberate. A simple message. I'm here. I'm not going to hurt you. He held her gaze longer than she expected. Then, gathering what strength he had, he returned the nod. Slow, stiff, unmistakable. It was the first fragile bridge between their worlds, a truce spoken without words. He slipped back under soon after, claimed again by the fever. Yet something had changed. The air inside the cabin, once thick with dread, seemed to loosen, just a little. Outside, the world had not forgotten her. Trouble arrived wearing a black coat and riding a tired mule. Olin Creed, the circuit preacher who thrived on fire and damnation. His sermons always circled the same sins, the same hatred, the same warnings about the savage. He saw himself as the moral spine of adobe walls and made it his duty to keep watch over everyone else. He rode a swayback mule and carried a Bible that looked more like a weapon than a guide. Lorne spotted him long before he reached her place, a thin, dark figure bobbing across the grass. Panic surged. She couldn't turn him away. That alone would mark her as guilty. Letting him inside was worse, but her mind raced. She dragged a heavy quilt over the sleeping boy, folding it until it looked like nothing more than a heap of bedding. It was a weak lie, but it was the only one she had. She checked the colt at her hip, smoothed her apron, and set her face into a practiced mask of tired calm. She opened the door just as he lifted his hand to knock, hoping to keep him standing outside. "Reverend," she said, her voice tight. "What brings you all the way out here, Lorne Whitby?" His tone was smooth and measured, his eyes narrow and sharp as a hawk's as they slid past her shoulder into the dim cabin. "The Lord placed a worry for your solitary soul upon my heart," he said. "And your neighbor, Vaughn Mercer, mentioned there was no smoke from your chimney this morning. In times like these, a person checks on their own." It was a lie, and she knew it. Vaughn Mercer lived for gossip and likely spent his days spying on her place through a piece of glass. "I'm fine, Reverend," Lorne replied, just worn down. "Are you?" He eased past her anyway, stepping inside before she could block him. His nostrils flared, as if he could smell wrongdoing in the air. "It's close in here," he muttered, heavy. His gaze drifted around the room and settled on the pallet near the hearth, half hidden under blankets. "Mending quilts," she said quickly, her heart pounding. Winter comes faster than folks expect. Olin Creed moved closer, a hard, righteous crease cutting his brow. Then it happened. A faint groan slipped from beneath the quilt, followed by a single muffled word, thick with fever. Maru. The sound barely carried, but in that strained quiet, it cracked like a rifle shot. Olin Creed went rigid. His head snapped toward the pallet, then back to Lorne. Suspicion in his eyes curdled into horror. He stumbled back, fingers clutching the dull silver cross at his chest. "What blasphemy is this?" he hissed, his voice shaking with fear and fury. "What have you done, woman?" Before she could answer, he lunged forward and tore the quilt away. The boy lay revealed, copper skin slick with sweat, pain carved deep into his face. He looked impossibly small. The preacher recoiled as though struck. "A heathen savage," he spat. "In your house? Have you lost all sense? This is treason. You've invited the devil himself to your door." "He's a child," Lorne said. Her voice trembled, but something hard held it steady. "He was dying. I couldn't leave him." "He is evil-born," Olin Creed shouted, his composure shattering. "His kind murdered your husband. They burn homes and steal children, and you shelter one? You are damned alongside him." He backed toward the door, revulsion twisting his face. "The Red Clay Men will hear of this. They will know what you've done. They will know Lorne Whitby keeps a serpent at her breast. May God show you mercy, because they will not." He fled the cabin, fumbling with his mule's reins as he went. Lorne stood frozen, watching him disappear. Her breath stayed locked in her chest until the frantic clatter of hooves dissolved into the wind. The quiet that followed was different. Not the stillness of loneliness, but the silence of a woman already judged. She sank into the rocking chair, the Winchester cold and heavy across her knees. She hadn't called war to her door. It had come uninvited and kicked it open. The truth was loose now. Within hours it would race through adobe walls like fire through dry grass, and they would come for her. She didn't know whether they would come carrying ropes or torches, but she knew they would come. Lorne Whitby glanced toward the boy. Kesh lay untouched by it all, lost in sleep, unaware of the storm his fragile life had unleashed. His survival was now bound to hers, tied together in a knot that only death might loosen. Outside, the sun slid low, streaking the sky with fire and bruised purple. A harsher truth settled over her. She had feared the Comanche for years, but now her closest and perhaps deadliest threat was her own people. Olin Creed's condemnation had sealed her fate with the settlers. Any mercy left among them was gone. Her only hope, thin and desperate, rested with the very ones she had been taught to dread. She found herself praying for the boy to live, not only from compassion, but from a chilling realization taking shape in her mind. If the Red Clay Men came for her, survival might depend on the arrival of his people. The second day was slipping away. Inside the cabin, a fragile calm remained. Beyond it, the land was sharpening for blood. As night settled in, another sound rode the wind. At first it was barely there. A dull, rhythmic pulse she felt through the soles of her boots before she truly heard it. It was not the uneven clip of a preacher's mule. It was the sound of many horses moving together. And it was drawing closer. The plains themselves seemed to beat with it. A low, resonant thunder that grew from a whisper in the floorboards to a tremor thick in the air. It carried the promise of a storm, not rain or lightning, but hooves and resolve. Lorne stood frozen in the center of her cabin, twilight slanting through the lone window, dust drifting in the glow like ash. Her first thought was that Creed had sent them, that the men from Adobe Walls, bolstered by whiskey and self-righteous rage, were coming to deliver their brand of frontier justice. She grabbed the Winchester, hands locked tight around the stock, and edged toward the door, peering through a narrow crack. What she saw on the horizon drained the blood from her face. Fear of her neighbors vanished, replaced by something far older and deeper. This was no posse. A posse was a jumble of farmers and traders on borrowed horses. This was something else entirely. They crested the western rise like a living shadow, a dark tide rolling against the bruised sky, an army, hundreds strong, moving with terrifying unity, horse and rider bound into a single will. Fading light flashed along lance points, rifle barrels, and stark patterns of war paint stretched across faces and ponies alike. This was not the work of Olin Creed. This was the answer to the name whispered through fevered lips. This was Maru. Lorne's breath caught. The scale of it defied sense. This was no raid. A raid meant 20, maybe 30 warriors. This was an entire nation on the move. What kind of child lay on her floor that his absence could summon such power? She slammed the door and dropped the heavy bar across it. A useless act against what was coming. The chaos in her mind stilled, replaced by a strange, hollow calm. The stillness that comes when escape is no longer possible. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Her 160 acres were about to become the center of everything. She looked again at Kesh. His breathing had softened, easing into something closer to real sleep than fever. In the dim light, he looked impossibly small, the quiet heart of all that thunder. Then a new thought cut through her fear, sharp and undeniable. They weren't riding to strike Adobe Walls. Not yet. This was a hunt. They advanced in a broad, deliberate sweep, spreading across the land with purpose. They were searching for someone. Her cabin was nothing more than a speck in their path, easy to miss. They might have passed her by. But then she remembered the faint ribbon of smoke still lifting from her chimney, left from warming broth. A signal. An answer to a question they hadn't yet spoken. A choice stood before her. In those last minutes, she could still run. She could try to hide the boy, lie her way through it, pray they rode on without noticing. Or she could step out and face them. The first felt like betrayal of the risk she had already taken. The second felt like a death sentence. She went to the hearth and looked down at the child. Kesh slept quietly, his face slack and calm, the tight grip of pain finally eased. She had stitched his wound. She had broken his fever. She had given him water and broth. She had never been his enemy. She had been his shelter. That truth was all she had left, and it would have to be enough. With resolve drawn from somewhere beyond fear, she chose. She slid the bar free and opened the door. Cool evening air rushed in, heavy with dust, horses, and the sharp charge of what was coming. She left the Winchester propped against the wall. To face them armed would be a challenge, an act of hostility. She would meet them empty-handed. The Colt stayed at her hip. Some rules on the frontier were ironclad, and surrendering the last means of defense was never one of them. She stepped onto the porch, her simple calico dress looking thin and foolish against the force gathering before her. The thunder of hooves slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed struck like a blow. They had seen her. The riders curved inward, forming a vast, soundless crescent around her land. Their ponies shifted and snorted softly in the dimming light. Now she could see the details. Eagle feathers braided into hair, beadwork worked into leggings and moccasins, faces unreadable and still. These were not the shrieking monsters of frontier nightmares. They were disciplined warriors, calm and patient, their quiet more frightening than any shout. From the heart of the line, one rider moved forward. He carried authority in the way he rode, as if the space itself bent around him. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face looked carved from stone. Two bold streaks of black and white paint cut across his cheekbones. An eagle feather war bonnet streamed down his back. But it was his eyes that fixed Lorne Whitby in place. Dark, piercing, filled with ancient sorrow and relentless strength. Beneath him, a powerful black war pony stamped and rolled its neck, mirroring its rider's contained fury. He pulled his horse to a halt 20 yards from her porch. Behind him, the others held fast, a silent tribunal. This was him. This had to be Maru. He said nothing at first. He only studied her, his eyes moving over the worn calico dress, the small homestead, the open doorway behind her. It was a look that peeled away every false layer, seeing both the fear and the stubborn defiance battling inside her. Lorne Whitby's heart hammered like a trapped bird against her ribs, yet she did not lower her gaze. She had come too far for that. To show fear now would undo every step that had brought her here. The silence stretched tight and thin, ready to tear. Even the land seemed to pause. The fate of adobe walls, the future of the territory, and her own small, unyielding life balanced in the space between one woman on a porch and a silent chief astride a black warhorse. Then he spoke. His voice was deep and steady, a low rumble that felt as if it rose straight from the earth. He uttered a single word in his own language. It was not a question. It was a claim. Though she did not understand the tongue, Lorne knew its meaning. He was naming his son. Slowly, with intention, she gave one deliberate nod. She stepped back from the porch edge and extended one open hand toward the dark doorway of her cabin. It was an invitation and a confession, both. A surrender to the choice she had made 3 days earlier. Maru swung down from his horse. He passed the reins of his war pony to a nearby warrior and walked toward the cabin. His stride was long and unhurried, moccasins silent on the packed earth. This was not the walk of a man bracing for violence. It was the walk of a father returning to his child. And when he crossed the threshold and vanished into the dim interior, the 3-day vigil ended, and judgment began. The instant Maru entered, the cabin seemed to draw inward, dwarfed by his presence. He filled the space not only with his size, but with authority and a grief so heavy it pressed against the walls. The air thickened. Lorne remained outside, spine stiff, feeling the weight of countless eyes on her back. She gave him this moment, one private breath in a world that had become a spectacle. Inside, there was no sound. Seconds dragged, then minutes, each one stretching into something unbearable. She could hear her own pulse roaring in her ears. She imagined him kneeling beside the pallet, the warrior's mask breaking at the sight of his wounded son. She braced for fury, for a shout of rage or a cry of loss. She expected him to storm back out, eyes burning, to pass judgment and seal her fate. But the quiet endured. It was not empty silence, but one thick with emotion, too deep for words. Unease rippled through the waiting riders. A few horses shifted. A murmur stirred, cut short by a sharp glance from Rune, restoring order. At last, Mahru appeared again in the doorway. In the deepening dusk, his face was unreadable, a dark outline against the faint lamplight behind him. For a long moment, he looked past Lorne, out toward the assembled Korra. Then he turned, and his piercing gaze locked onto hers. He motioned for her to come closer with a slow, deliberate tilt of his head. Her legs felt heavy as iron as she stepped down from the porch and crossed the short distance to him. This was the moment. Judgment. She stopped a few paces away, folding her hands at her waist to still their shaking. Lorne Whitby raised her chin, prepared for whatever would follow. Mahru looked down at her, and in the low light she saw a change pass through his eyes. The stone-hard edge was still there, but beneath it lay a sorrow deeper than anything she had known. And now, something else. Confusion. Deep, unsettling confusion. When he spoke, his voice was subdued, stripped of command, carrying a quiet force instead. He gestured toward the cabin. "He lives," Mahru said. His English was rough and accented, but unmistakable. It was not a question. It was disbelief given voice. Lorne answered, her words scraping out of her throat. The fever was fierce. The wound was bad. But he lives. Mahru studied her, his gaze unblinking. "The wound," he said slowly. "It is closed, like the work of a white healer." He motioned again. "There is medicine on him. You did this." "Yes," she said, finding a sliver of strength in her voice. He stepped closer. Instinct urged her to retreat, but she held her ground. From this distance, she could see the wear etched into his face. Dust ground deep into the lines of exhaustion. This was not a man thirsting for blood. This was a father stretched to the edge of what he could endure. "Why?" he asked. One word, weighted with countless questions. "Why would you, white woman, enemy, do this? Why risk your people's anger? Why risk ours?" Standing before the man whose people had taken Bram Hollis, Lorne spoke the truth she had carried in silence. "I lost a son to fever once," she said, her voice breaking despite herself. "No mother should watch her child die alone in the dirt." The word mother lingered between them. It bridged more than language or blood. It crossed paint and skin and war. Mahru's expression shifted just for an instant. The warrior faded, leaving only a father. Then the night turned. A weak voice came from inside the cabin. "Ta." Mahru spun toward the sound. He crossed the room in long strides, Lorne following as far as the doorway dared allow. Kesh's eyes were open now, clear, no longer lost to fever. They fixed on his father. A faint smile touched the boy's lips. "Ta," he whispered again. The word meant only for one man. He lifted his hand, not toward Mahru, but toward Lorne. His finger pointed at the empty bowl and spoon by his side. "She gave me water." Mahru's gaze moved from his son to the bowl, then back to Lorne. The proof was undeniable. The clean bandages, the broth, the simple miracle of a child awake and speaking. The chief knelt, resting a broad, gentle hand on his son's forehead. "The fever has passed," he murmured in his own tongue, reverence softening his voice. His eyes followed the stitched line along Kesh's side. He traced it lightly with his finger, his touch careful, almost tender. His brow tightened. "Oh, this is not the work of a settler's bullet," he said, shifting back into English, his eyes fixed on Lorne Whitby. "The wound is wrong. There is no lead. It was a tear, Lorne replied, ragged. As from a fall, Maru finished, his voice cooling, or the point of a lance. He turned back to his son and spoke softly in their own language. Kesh answered faintly, each word a little stronger than the last. The exchange was brief. As Lorne watched, Maru's expression changed completely. Confusion and grief drained away, replaced by a hard, focused fury. With a jolt, she understood. The anger was not for her. The chief straightened. When he spoke again, the night delivered its final, shattering turn. "My son was not running from your people," Maru said, his voice a low growl. 4 days ago, we were attacked at the sacred ground by the Cimarron River. The Ash Kiowa broke the treaty. They ride with new rifles. They seek our hunting lands while our warriors are scattered. He pointed east. They struck us from hiding. Kesh was hit by a lance meant for me. In the chaos, his horse bolted. We believed the Kiowa took him, or that the plains claimed him. We searched day and night, expecting to find his body, or worse. Everything Lorne had believed, everything whispered at adobe walls, collapsed. This had never been a Comanche strike on settlers. It wasn't vengeance for a stolen child. It was a war between nations. The settlers did not even know they were standing inside. She and her small cabin had fallen into the center of a story that had nothing to do with them. Until now. Maru studied her, his thoughts plain in his stillness. His son, his only heir, had been lost, wounded unto death. Not taken by the Kiowa, not killed by whites. He had been found and saved by a widowed woman who, by every rule of this land, should have turned away. An enemy who had shown a mother's mercy. The debt was beyond measure. "You have done a thing," Maru said slowly, the words heavy, "that our storytellers will sing when the mountains are dust. You sheltered the son of a chief, the future of our people, from our enemies and from your own." He turned and stepped out into the open, into the waiting ranks of the Kora. Raising his hand, he summoned a warrior who brought a long ceremonial lance, finely made, bearing a shield marked with the charging symbol of an iron-horned buffalo. Maru did not go to his horse. He walked back to Lorne's porch. He extended the lance toward her. "This is my mark," he declared, his voice carrying the black horn. "Where it stands, the land is mine. The people upon it are my people. No Kiowa will cross it, and no white man from there," he nodded toward adobe walls, "will bring you harm. An insult to you is an insult to me. They will learn this." This was no gift. It was a proclamation. Maru drove the lance deep into the hard earth at the corner of her porch, staking her life beneath his personal and terrible protection. It rose firm and unyielding beside her porch, the shield catching moonlight like a cold eye. An unmistakable sign of a bond both powerful and perilous. Maru had not brought his warriors to burn her home. He had brought them to give thanks, in the only language a Comanche war chief recognized. In saving her from one enemy, he had placed her directly before another. Her life no longer belonged solely to herself. It now rested beneath the mark of the black horn. The Comanche did not remain. Their purpose was complete. What had been lost was found. From their ranks stepped a medicine man, Savo, an aged figure with eyes that seemed to look past flesh and into bone. He entered the cabin, spoke briefly with Maru, then examined Kesh's wound. He gave a small nod, approval clear, acknowledging Lorne Whitby's careful stitching. A travois was assembled, simple, sturdy. lashed between two horses and lined with thick buffalo robes. Kesh, awake and clear-eyed, was lifted gently by two strong warriors and carried out. As they passed, the boy's dark gaze met Lorne's. He said nothing. Instead, he gave her the same slow, deliberate nod he had offered before. A sign of respect, a silent vow born in fever and quiet courage. Mahru mounted his black war pony. The host that had stood like a threatening tide shifted smoothly, opening to cradle the travois at its guarded heart. Before he turned away, the chief looked back one final time. Lorne stood alone on her porch, small beside the towering lance now claiming her land. "The debt is not finished," Mahru called, his voice carrying across the open prairie. "It can never be finished, but my word is law. You are a horn-bound woman, friend of the Iron Buffalo. Live without fear." Then he wheeled his horse and vanished into the dark with his people, their leaving as swift and soundless as their coming. The thunder of hooves faded, and silence returned, changed forever. The old quiet had been shaped by grief and isolation. This new silence carried obligation and the cold truth of what she had become. Lorne Whitby was no longer simply a widow on the plains. She was claimed ground, a piece of Comanche territory adrift in a widening sea of white settlement. The lance was a shield, but also a challenge. Morning brought what could not be avoided. A thick cloud of dust rolled in from adobe walls. This time it was a posse. Olin Creed rode at the front, hunched on his mule like a black-winged scavenger, flanked by a dozen hard-faced men, Vaughn Mercer among them. They came armed, with rifles, shotguns, and a shared certainty of righteousness. They halted 50 yards from her home, horses restless, eyes wide. None of them looked at Lorne. They stared at the Comanche lance. It stood alien and terrible in the morning light, humming with meaning they barely understood. The shield bearing the charging buffalo spoke plainly. "Witchcraft!" Olin Creed screamed, his voice splitting. He thrust a shaking finger at the lance. "She has made a pact with savages. That mark is the devil's own." "It's a Comanche war lance," Vaughn Mercer whispered, awe and terror mixing in his tone. "I've seen one once on a dead warrior, but never like this." She simply stood there. Then Lorne Whitby stepped out onto the porch, her hands empty, the Colt still cold against her hip. A strange calm had settled over her. The terror of the night before had burned itself out, leaving behind something harder, clean, unshakable certainty. "Go home, Reverend," she said, her voice level and clear. "There's nothing for you here." "We've come for the heathen you were hiding," one of the men shouted. "And for you?" another added. "You traitor?" "He's gone," Lorne answered. "His father came for him." Uneasy looks passed through the posse. They had seen the ground. The earth around her cabin was torn and churned by hundreds of hooves. They had assumed she had summoned a war party to wipe them out. The notion that such a force had come, taken one boy, and left a single woman untouched made no sense to them. "His father," Olin Creed sneered. "You lie. You danced with demons, and they marked you as one of their own. That thing," he spat, jerking a finger toward the lance, "is an insult to God." He kicked his mule, spurring it forward as if to rip the lance from the ground himself. The animal balked, refusing to move, its ears pinned back, sensing the fear in its rider and the raw power of the symbol before it. "That lance," Lorne said, her voice cutting cleanly through the tension, "is the word of Mahru." She held their eyes one by one. He told me that where it stands is his ground. The people on it are his people. An insult to me, she continued, is an insult to him. A shiver of fear rippled through the men. They knew the name. Black Horn, a chief spoken of in whispers, a strategist of legend, a man known for mercy only when it served him, and for annihilation when it did not. They had ridden out expecting to frighten a lone widow. Instead, they stood before the declared ground of a war king. To strike her now, to tear down that lance, would be to invite a war they could never survive. It would bring the full weight of the Comanche nation crashing down on their fragile settlement. Slowly, the hunger for punishment drained from their faces, replaced by cold calculation. They had come to destroy a traitor. Now they saw that the so-called traitor was the only thing standing between them and ruin. Olin Creed alone remained blind. "Do not heed her blasphemy," he shouted. "She speaks with a serpent's tongue. He is one man. We are Christians." But no one was listening anymore. They were staring at the lance, at the thousands of hoofprints, at the woman on the porch who no longer looked like prey, but like an envoy of something vast and dangerous. Vaughn Mercer, practical where his own life was concerned, slowly lowered his rifle. "This ain't our fight, Reverend. Not anymore." He turned his horse. "I'm going home." Booker shouted. One by one, the others followed, their bravado dissolving in the morning light. They rode away, leaving Olin Creed alone in the dust, his face flushed with helpless rage. He glared at Lorne, his mouth working soundlessly. At last, muttering a curse that carried no holiness at all, he yanked his mule around and fled. Lorne Whitby watched them disappear. The tension eased from her body inch by inch. She was safe, for now. In the weeks and months that followed, an unspoken truce settled over the prairie. The Red Clay men kept their distance from Lorne Whitby's homestead, fear outweighing whatever hatred they still carried. They spoke of her in low voices, calling her the Branded Widow, a name edged with dread and awe. She became more isolated than ever. Yet, in a bitter twist, she was also the most untouchable soul in the territory. Traders bound for the fort sometimes left things on her porch without knocking: a sack of flour, a bolt of cloth, a pouch of coffee beans. They were not gestures of friendship. They were offerings, tributes to the unseen power whose mark guarded her land. Attempts to stay on the right side of Mahru, whose protection now defined her existence. Her days settled into a quiet, solitary rhythm. But it was a solitude weighted with meaning. One crisp autumn morning, she found a white buffalo robe draped across her railing, an object so rare and sacred it stole her breath. On another day, a line of fine ponies stood tied to her fence, the best stock she had ever laid eyes on. There were no notes, no riders, only messages, silent reminders from Mahru that the debt between them still lived. She never saw Kesh again, but she knew he had survived. She knew that one day he would lead his people, perhaps carrying with him the memory of a lone woman who had chosen mercy when the world offered him none. Lorne Whitby, widow of the plains, had risked her life for an enemy. In doing so, she had found something she never imagined: a future. Not one filled with comfort or the gentle ghosts of family, but a stark and dangerous life, standing between two worlds that still mistrusted one another. Yet as she stood on her porch, gazing out across the endless, quiet grasslands, the lance of the Black Horn planted firm beside her, she understood something clearly. She was no longer merely enduring. She was ruling. A sovereign of a kingdom of one, her crown a Comanche lance. Her authority born from a single, impossible act of mercy. The heart she believed long buried beat strong and steady now. A soft drum echoing across the Wild West. This is how the story of Lauren Whitby and the Iron Buffalo's son comes to rest. It is proof that in a land shaped by violence and loss, the greatest power was never steel or lead, but compassion. Her choice did more than save a child. It reshaped the rules of survival, turned an enemy into a guardian, and transformed an outcast into a living legend. It reminds us that the bravest act is not always facing an army, but opening a door to one dying soul. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Your presence means more than you know. If today's story awakened something inside you, don't let the trail end here. There are many more tales of courage, devotion, and faith waiting to be discovered. Subscribe, comment, share, and come back as we continue this unforgettable journey. Thank you, truly. Aviso legal. Disclaimer: all stories are intended solely for entertainment and may include fictionalized scenarios or dramatization derived from historical contexts. While AI assists in production, human creators supervise and adjust every piece to maintain sincerity, credibility, and emotional quality. We adhere entirely to platform regulations regarding AI content, ensuring no deepfakes or misleading portrayals. Licensed materials are used responsibly. Republishing, modifying, or extracting content without authorization is not allowed. We appreciate every viewer who respects originality and creative effort.